Welcome to our latest webinar and thank you for joining us. I hope you're all well and staying safe. I'm going to be handing over to our first expert speaker very shortly, but to begin with, a couple of notes regarding the webinar platform we are using. The main thing you need to know is that you can direct questions to our speakers for today via the Q&A option on our toolbar at any time throughout the webinar. The toolbar is likely to be at the foot of your screen. If you cannot see the toolbar, just hover around the bottom of your screen and it will appear. Once located, simply type your question into the text box provided and click or tap Submit. Our chair for the Q&A session, Jason Reeves, CEnv of CEnv, will run through questions with the speakers once the talk is complete. Secondly, you are all on mute. As with all of our webinars, this is nothing against you. It just helps the webinar run smoothly without distractions or background noise. The webinar is being recorded and will be available in the coming days via our website, YouTube channel, and if you've opted in to receive emails from us, you will receive an email with the recording link. For those watching the webinar as a recording, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at any time using the details on your screen. So very quickly, you're watching a Society for the Environment webinar. We hold the two professional registers for environmental professionals, the Chartered Environmentalist or CEnv register and the Registered Environmental Technician or RM Tech register. The Society operates as an umbrella organisation, currently made up of 24 professional bodies known as our licensed members. All of these professional bodies hold a licence granted by the Society to award the CEnv registration to their members. 3 of these also offer the RM Tech registration, which are now highlighted. To become a CEnv or RM Tech, you will need to be a member of and apply via one of these professional bodies. You'll be joining nearly 7,500 registrants from across sectors and disciplines, and as of this month, we've registered 10,000 chartered environmentalists in total. If you want to find out more, please visit socenv.org.uk or inquire with the relevant professional body directly. So, onto the webinar itself. The aim of our numerous webinar series is to increase knowledge transfer opportunities for environmental professionals and interested parties. This webinar is the second part of a special series running this week in celebration of World Environment Day, which is this Friday, the 5th of June. Each year we champion World Environment Day in the UK and beyond. This year, the global theme for World Environment Day is biodiversity, a topic which registered environmental professionals agree is hugely important for the environment, both currently and looking to the future. Today, we're shining a spotlight on inspirational real-life examples of what environmental professionals and organisations are doing to enhance biodiversity in their area. So, our first expert speaker today is Chris Gerrard, CEnv, Natural Catchment and Biodiversity Manager at Anglian Water. So, a huge welcome to Chris. Are you with us?
Morning.
Morning. Yeah. If you're all set, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just sharing my screen now. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to talk to you today. What I'm proposing to cover over the next 10 minutes is just 2 projects that we've been working on to understand the value of our sites for biodiversity, and in doing so help Anglian Water play its part in addressing the biodiversity crisis, at least in our region in the east of England. I'm the Catchment and Biodiversity Manager. Anglian Water, I've been with the company for about 6 years. I look a lot older than that now, and thanks to COVID-19, considerably hairier at the moment. But also wanted to give a shout out to my colleague Kylie Jones, who runs our biodiversity team, who's been very involved in both of the projects that I'm going to be covering over the next few minutes. You can find out more about both of the things I'll be discussing in a case study that's available from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership's website. We were members of the Natural Capital Impact Groups. We worked with other businesses to develop metrics to help companies understand and reduce the impact of their activities, and that was a considerable source of inspiration for our work on our own sites in the Anglian region. Another really helpful piece of work that we did, which sort of underpins this, is a natural capital account for the east of England, which is available for Anglian Water's website. The web address is on the screen there. This is really important. Most companies, when they're thinking about natural capital, start by thinking about their own impacts and dependencies. We took a step further back and actually asked what was the natural capital of the east of England like, and this was really important, and it gave us the sorts of information that you can see now. So we cover about 23% of England, with the largest water company by geographic area, significantly dominated by really good quality agricultural land, which means that a lot of the eastern region is dominated by farming. And that means, consequently, that the area of land in our region, which is of high quality for biodiversity, is somewhat reduced. And that, alongside climate change and growth pressures in the region, means that biodiversity is under significant pressure, and we all need to work to address it. So I'd encourage you to both look at both of those documents at your leisure. So we're a water and water recycling company. We cover from the Humber Estuary down to the edge of London, from the east coast to the centre of England. We're a highly regulated company as a landowner and water company. And we have about 7,000 hectares of land covering about the same number of sites, give or take. And about 600 of those sites are important for biodiversity, in terms of whether they're SSI, whether they're a local wildlife site, or whether they have priority habitat on them. So we've got a significant resource that we have a duty to manage. And the distribution of that around our region is significant. And because of that, we have 4 long-term goals, and each of these are really relevant to the natural environment, either reducing the pressures on them or doing what we can to enhance the environment. The bottom one there, significantly improving the ecological quality of our catchments, is really important. It essentially speaks to our need to improve water quality in rivers by making sure that the land that drains into them is managed in a sustainable way. So here's a map of sites across our region, and what you can see is that the vast majority of sites are tiny. Over 5,000 of those 7,000 are less than a hectare. And then we have a few larger sites around the region, the biggest being Rutland Water in the west. And we have a lot of different types of habitats. So we have ancient woodlands, fens, grasslands, heathlands and scrub. And as you'd expect, large areas of rivers and lake, principally lakes, so Grafham Water, Rutland Water and Pittsford Water, 3 big trip SIs that we manage, for example, dominating that habitat. But we've got land across the region on our assets, and those assets are, of course, operational places, places where we build, maintain and refurbish water recycling centres, water treatment works, pumping stations and so on. And between our sites we are laying lots of pipes routinely every year to connect our network together. And more latterly, of increasing importance is building solar panels for generating renewable electricity and playing our part in reducing our carbon footprint. We set out to consider adopting a net gain policy as part of our Anglian water biodiversity strategy. And this is what we've been focused on for the last 18 months or so. And we worked with consultants WSP to do this. They organised a business workshop for us to bring colleagues who are going to be impacted by delivering a net gain policy together and help them understand what it is and what their role would be. A significant piece of work was to do a lot of GIS gathering, data gathering and analysis, which then created the biodiversity baseline, which we now have in place. And they also provided baseline recommendations. So what we now have for each of all the sites for which we have land registry data, so about 5,500, 6,500 sites, baseline data for each of those sites. So we know which sites have designations, we know the habitat patches on each of these sites, and we have a biodiversity unit for each of those sites. And what that enables us to do is to provide information very, very early on in the design process. So now when an engineer is told that he or she needs to design some sort of new process to go on a site, they'll call up a map and information from our asset management software, which will give us information about the biodiversity value of the site that they're going to be building on. And that will help them to have a very early estimation of the impact on biodiversity of their development, and therefore early information on how they can use the mitigation hierarchy to reduce that impact, perhaps by moving the location of the asset onto an area of lower value for biodiversity, or indeed into perhaps an existing building or structure that can be repurposed, therefore eliminating any biodiversity impact at all. This baseline is made up of a range of data sets, some very high quality ones and some lower quality ones. But given the sheer number of sites, what we couldn't do is actually go out and do a biodiversity assessment of each one ahead of time. But in order to make sure the baseline is accurate, when our ecologists go out to site to do the enabling work, they'll be furnished with a map and a biodiversity account for those ecologists on the ground to confirm that the baseline is correct, or indeed to say that it's wrong, that it's underestimated or overestimated the biodiversity value of the site, and then correct the baseline from an empirical analysis of the site. What this will enable us to do, of course, is to contribute to our target, which we set ourselves for the next 5 years, of delivering biodiversity net gain in line with what we anticipate being in the Environment Bill, which is at least a 10% net gain on the baseline that we have. So that's been a really, really important piece of work, and where we're now focused is on working on people, processes and tools. The baseline is all well and good, but without these three elements in place, we will fail. Critically, we need to have all of the people that are going to be involved with a clear understanding of what their role is, and make sure they're properly trained to understand the information that they're provided with. The tools, like our asset management software, need to be loaded up with things like the biodiversity baseline and information about the impacts of the changes to the baseline, so they can make the right decisions. And our processes need to accommodate the biodiversity data as well. So we have a very strong iterative challenge process to make sure that we're doing exactly what we should be doing in line with the goals that we set ourselves. And that is where the opportunity is to discuss with colleagues whether there's any way in which we can eliminate biodiversity impacts, and where we can't, how we can best address it. So that's been a really pleasing piece of work that we've been working on. But allied to that is another piece of work which I think certainly I'm really excited about, because it adds a lot of extra nuance to what we know about our sites through a biodiversity net gain baseline. So we know that a lot of focus on ecology now is about restoring ecological networks at a landscape scale, and no longer just managing small areas of existing biodiversity value. So Wildlife Trusts have a Living Landscapes initiative, and RSPB on their Futurescapes initiative, and so on. And we know that some of our sites can be a little bit of an oasis in a landscape which is otherwise fairly inhospitable. So what we have done is to analyse our sites according to 3 of the 4 Lawton principles. So his report, John Lawton's report, Making Space for Nature, sets out the need to create more sites in the countryside of biodiversity value, to connect them together, to manage them well, and to create big sites as well. And all these things will help to restore the ecological functioning of biodiversity across the country. And we worked with the University of East Anglia to test our sites according to 3 of those 4 principles. The one we didn't test was the more principle, simply because we're probably not going to be in the game of buying land to restore wildlife on it. But what the University of East Anglia did was to create 3 or 9 scores based on the 3 elements of better, bigger and join. So under better, they looked at functionally significant areas of habitat on our sites, sites that actually have biological records on them which show the species using those sites reflect the habitats that are found on them. and those species which demonstrate a high quality of habitat found on our sites. For bigger, they scored our sites against what's called a saturating curve, where even small sites are really valuable for biodiversity, and the bigger they get, the value decreases or flattens off. An intermediate curve where smaller sites are less valuable, but medium sites are given more value, as are larger sites, perhaps because they're big enough to allow species like birds, for example, to carry out their entire life cycle on a site. Or just giving higher scores to the very biggest of sites where a high degree of habitat heterogeneity is available to allow a degree of wildness on our sites. And under joined, whether they're in a protected area network, their proximity to priority habitats, or their presence within a landscape scale conservation initiative like a living landscape. And this has enabled us to score all of our sites from top to bottom. Top score is 1, and going all the way down to the bottom. And so the 3 areas of different scores contribute to a site score overall. And what this has given us for the first time is an appreciation of our sites in the context of the wider landscape. You can see here the purple scores, the deeper blues are the higher value sites. And so you start to get an idea that actually some parts of our region are more important than others. So the South Bedfordshire chalk and the Greensand Ridge, the South Cambridgeshire chalk, the Brecks, the Suffolk Coast and Heath, and up into the Broads, for example, would seem to be an area that we need to focus. And whilst when we did analysis of the top sites, most of them we already knew about, some of them we didn't. This is a small site called Horning Knackers Wood in Norfolk, which we never knew about. It had no value really on the site itself, but it scored really quite highly, I think number 20 on our list, because of its proximity to the Ant and Broad Marshes National Nature Reserve, which it's adjacent to. So with this information, we can now start to change the order of the value of our sites and perhaps put more emphasis on sites like these than we would have done in the past. So these 2 projects together complement each other. The net gain work is really useful, helps us demonstrate compliance with the Environment Bill and net gain requirements, but the UEA work helps us to perhaps add more nuance to that and get really involved in discussions about how we deliver net gain in a way which takes real account of the value of our sites. Just to finish, what's coming up for us in the next few years? Well, turning biodiversity net gain policy into practice is, of course, really, really important. We're going to be judged on our performance there. Thinking about what's an enhanced biodiversity duty might look like for water companies if the Environment Bill makes it through to statute with that proposal intact. Looking at nature-based solutions to our operational needs, things like treatment wetlands, which deliver a treatment job for us, but also a nature-based outcome as well. And thinking about environmental net gain, which is something that we would support being the next sort of policy development going on from biodiversity net gain. Well, I hope you found that interesting. It's a very quick canter through 2 projects, which I'm really excited about and which give us, I think, a really good foothold to do some really interesting things for biodiversity over the next 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I thought it was some really great insight there. Moving on, we have our second expert speaker, which is Tom Gray, CEnv Senior Ecological Consultant at Arup. So a huge welcome to Tom. Are you with us?
Yes, I'm with you.
Okay, brilliant.
Thanks very much for having us. I'm really pleased to be speaking to you. I've been a member of CEnv for a short while, well, a few years. I think I got chartered 4 or 5 years ago through CEnv. My name's Tom Gray. I work at a company called Arup, and the picture in the background there is one of North Yorkshire. I was lucky enough to grow up in that part of the world. And before moving to London, it's nearly 10 years ago since I moved down to the northeast. But growing up in that sort of part of the world is what really probably gave me just a passion for nature. I lived in a very small village and had access to woodlands, rivers, forestry all my life, and so in the work I do now, I really try and work towards making sure there is equitable access to green space for everybody, because I recognise how important it is, as does the scientific community in the world at large. Arup, just to give you a really brief background, in case you don't know, we're not a massive company in the grand scheme of things. It's about 15,000 people across nearly, I think it's 90 odd offices. And our company motto is "We shape a better world." And as part of that, we recognise that the importance of sustainability in everything that we do. And the company committed a few years ago to embedding the Sustainable Development Goals and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in all of the work that we do. Kind of in recognition that our concept of 21st century lifestyle is unsustainable, and then when you think in terms of the resource of the planet, and then when you consider the sheer quantity of people who are going to desire to move into the kind of middle class area that the majority of the Western world occupy, and the sheer demand on resources that's going to require, you can see that the next few years are going to be quite challenging. We kind of looked at how the Sustainable Development Goals could apply to our company, and kind of taking our motto, "We shape a better world," we kind of investigated what does better look like. And at a company level, our leadership have recognized that kind of global best practice is kind of still at the small net losses in biodiversity being acceptable, and we know that we need to move away as a business and industry and as a world from this kind of idea that biodiversity loss is an acceptable thing, to moving towards a world where we are, by the very design of the projects we're doing, restoring ecosystems and creating a space in which our developments are regenerating ecosystems and the planet's resources. Kind of in recognition of that, our biodiversity team in Leeds put together a set of biodiversity and natural resources horizon scanning cards, kind of looking at what the future is for the biodiversity industry, what the stresses and the strains are on our global resources, but also looking at some key kind of solutions to these problems. If you are interested, please take a look. It's at arup.com/biodiversity trends. And we can even send you a copy of these once we're back in the office. But rather than speak too much about our company, I wanted to talk about a project which I think exemplifies this approach, where biodiversity is put at the heart of the development. Now, this is where I don't live here right now. This is Piccadilly Circus in the bottom left, with Green Park, Buckingham Palace on the left hand, St James Park, Buckingham Palace on the left hand side, and some of London's parks extending off into the distance. We worked with a client called the Crown Estate, who happen to own the majority of the buildings along Regent Street, and quite a few of the buildings to the south, which is the left hand side of this picture. Now, if you flip this image so that we're looking at London from north to south, with Regent's Park at the top and Green and St James's Park to the south, the orange buildings are the Crown Estate's land holding in central London. And when we began working with them, we worked with a real visionary sustainability lead that they had at the time, called Claudine Blamey, who she wanted us to look at their portfolio and see how can we do things in a more joined up manner, and how can we make things just more logical, more cumulatively beneficial for biodiversity, rather than looking at each building in isolation as it comes up for redevelopment. And the most obvious thing to us, as in terms of biodiversity, was that between Regent's Park and Green and St James's Park, the Crown Estate had an opportunity to really deliver a green corridor up and down the heart of London. But also this recognition that by doing so, you could create all of these new green corridors, east to west, north to south, across the city, which, so these green spaces that have been cut off for decades, centuries in some cases. This was all done with the idea that through enhancing biodiversity and improving the local amenity and the local environment, you could attract tenants and visitors, but also make it a better place for your existing customers, your existing residents, because people do live in that part of central London. Make it a better place to live, and also add value, not just in terms of the property portfolio, but in terms of giving back to the community, societal value. And the Crown Estate at the time kind of said, well, that's great if we do that in isolation, but we know that there's lots of other big landowners in the area who probably want to do the same thing, and wouldn't it be better if we were acting all as one? And that's where we developed this partnership together called the Wild West End Partnership. It's a partnership between 6 now. It was originally 5 of some of the biggest landholders in this part of London, where they all come together to work towards those targets we were looking at before: increasing biodiversity, increasing equitable access to green space, and improving things for the people who live and work in this part of London, both through improving their access to nature, but also increasing the climate change resilience of the city. We were supported on this by the London Wildlife Trust and by the Mayor of London's office, the GLA, both of whom gave advice and technical advice and feedback to us throughout to make sure that this had environmental and ecological rigor applied to it at every stage. The idea of this was that there are so many benefits of working in a partnership versus working in isolation, not just increased environmental benefits, but kind of the efficiency of doing it as a group rather than doing it alone. This idea that you're creating green islands in the centre of London is appealing in a certain way, but it's far more appealing if we can get several people doing, working towards the same thing. Also, it meant that, part of Arup's role was developing a brand for Wild West End, and it meant that rather than one group going it alone, there were several groups of people able to kind of maximise the engagement potential. The interesting thing about this project, where it's different to a lot of other projects that I've worked on, is that all of the partners who are involved in the Wild West End were behind the idea of designing primarily with the idea of increasing biodiversity in mind, but also making sure that no green space was ever designed with only one function. We know that green spaces are under a tremendous amount of pressure in central London and all of our cities around the world. So we really focused on making sure that all of the spaces designed are multifunctional. So where biodiversity can be a priority, it also has to deliver for health and well-being, i.e. allowing it to be accessible, visible to people, designed to collect water, so a green-blue roof, for instance. And the way we've achieved that through several means in the centre of London. This is just an image showing just some of the types of green space that we're trying to initiate as part of Wild West End. Food growing opportunities at roof level, green walls, community gardens where communities are able to define what they want in their spaces and define how it's created and how it's managed, all the way down to street trees, which are a massive, massive, massive challenge in the centre of London. I really can't understate that. To show you some of the results of what's come in terms of multifunctional green spaces, this is a biodiverse space that was designed to back onto a meeting room on one of the head offices on Regent Street to allow people using the office spaces to access green space during meetings or during their lunch times. And to be honest with you, this meeting room was really successful because it got booked up weeks before any other meeting room because of that access to green space. The Shaftesbury, one of the landowners, created this rooftop terrace, incorporating invertebrate features, green walls, and a beer fridge on their roof, so that when people, on a day like today, but maybe not at a time like today, people could go out and use this space and appreciate nature. It's not just spaces purely for people to access. This is a biodiverse roof, which was designed purely with biodiversity in mind, to attract invertebrates and pollinating and seed feeding species. At street level, there's been massive efforts to put fruit, vegetables, herbs in these spaces, and this is at the request of some of the clients at ground level, restaurants wanting to have access to these so that they could deliver them to their customers, fresh, straight from the street to the table via the kitchen, and some fairly robust washing procedures were assured. So it's just this idea that every space, no matter how big or small, could deliver something for people's health and well-being, or deliver something for biodiversity. It's not just about the all-singing, all-dancing, gigantic green roofs. Small spaces can contribute too. It also gave us an opportunity to experiment with new technology. This is a green wall system, which was designed by Arup and another company whose name I really ought to have remembered, but it was trialled by Grosvenor as an alternative to your standard construction screening. So the idea behind this was it creates a more pleasurable environment, but also it attracts biodiversity. And the design is, the future iterations of the design, we're hoping that we can reuse the green space that develops on this green wall over time as a seeding for other green features elsewhere. this, just to show you what it looks like, this is a 10-week difference. I think it was installed in late May a few years ago, and this is it by early July. So it starts off as a blank screen, but it's pre-seeded, and the idea is that it develops over time. We did some surveys on this, and we found goldfinch, blackbird, and several species of butterfly, bee, hoverfly, normal fly, spider living in this after only about 15 weeks. So this can bring real visual and biodiversity benefit to your construction sites and really change the feeling of them. One of the things our developer was most proud of was getting a strawberry growing on that green wall. Part of the Wild West End has been based around our communication strategy as well. We're putting all of our results online so that any member of the public can access and see the results of our monitoring surveys, like where are our green spaces, where are our bird species. So we've recorded black redstart in the centre of London, goldfinch, and all of this stuff is we've put it online so that people can access it and see what wildlife is in their backyard to hopefully help them engage with it more. But we've also facilitated people actually submitting their own records. And as well as that, like, the final thing I'll say is that another way we've tried to engage with people is by taking it beyond just printing a report out and really trying to bring people into the heart of what we're doing with Wild West End. This is a promotional video that was developed by the Wild West End Partnership, and it's designed to show just one of the ways that we've worked to engage with people. Now, every year the Regent Street is closed down for a few weekends, and we've put a stall there every year to talk about biodiversity and talk about the efforts that all of the people within central London are making to bring biodiversity back to it. In this example, children were brought in and dressed up as bees and taught about how pollination leads to honey. And it was a really successful way of engaging children and also giving parents breathing space, while also just letting people know there are these efforts going on in central London to bring nature there for the sake of the people living and working and visiting central London. And my favourite example of that actually is the bottom centre picture, where we have about 20 planters, where people are actually people who work on Regent Street, Piccadilly Circus, just around the corner, are growing their own fruits, their vegetables for their offices on the rooftop of Regent Street. And they're able to socialise, to meet and to discuss. And it's been a really successful initiative. And I know that was a kind of a rapid ride through that, but yeah, I'll finish there. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tom. I thought it was a really fascinating presentation, so thank you. I'm just going to... Okay, so our final expert speaker today is Christina Arnicevic, Senior Sustainability Manager at Canary Wharf Group. So a huge welcome to Christina. Are you with us, Christina?
Yes, thank you, Sarah.
Excellent.
Just going to share my screen now. Okay, well, thank you for having us. As Sarah mentioned, I'm a Senior Sustainability Manager at Canary Wharf Group, and in a little time that we have left, as we'd like to allow some space for the Q&A at the end, I'd like to share with you our approach to biodiversity integration, sustainable development, as well as climate action. So we try to take an integrated approach, as you will see from my slides. So besides what you might be imagining when you think of Canary Wharf, we are rather green, and we have over 160,000 square meters of parks and spaces and biodiverse roofs and little pockets of well-being space that our tenants and visitors can enjoy. And this is no accident. So this is something that's been planned as part of the master plan from the onset, as our designers and asset managers have always valued the space, not just for its amenity value, but for its contribution to well-being, as well as biodiversity and supporting various species that we've established on the estate. So just as a reminder, we started off with a blank page. Essentially, they were the derelict docks with the contaminated soil, and we've managed to revive the estate and really boost the amount of species that we're able to support. A good example of an integrated approach is the Crossrail Place. This is something that you might have heard about in terms of the best practice example of engineers and ecologists and architects working closely together. So this isn't just a transport hub or a retail zone. There's also a conference hall and a well-being center. So to be able to achieve such a level of integration, our teams had to work really closely with ecologists at early stages of design to make sure that whatever we needed to install for climate change adaptation, such as these attenuation tanks, and were also populated with reed beds, so we're able to support aquatic species as well as birds. So this approach scales across the estates. This is a map that we've developed as part of our biodiversity action plan. And as you can see, we support a variety of species, and the spaces that have been designated also are considerate of other impacts on the estate, such as heat island effect, and where we know there are identified risks of flooding. So the integrated approach is at the core of how we approach biodiversity. And that is because we'd like to support a variety of species. So we need to be able to make sure that our honeybees have what they need, as well as our tenants and visitors. I think I'd like to stress well-being here, in particular, as we're bouncing back and coming back from COVID and isolation. We're hearing from our tenants and our occupiers that well-being is certainly going to be a priority. We have a bespoke well-being strategy that addresses a number of considerations across the estate, which applies to all new developments and existing spaces. We measure air quality. We certainly are going to be boosting air quality provision, but what we find is that biodiversity is a key aspect for that, not just in terms of air quality, but in terms of psychological approach to how you're experiencing that space. And certainly, having been in isolation, we see that that is gaining priority. So what I'd like to talk to you about in more detail is our 10-year biodiversity action plan. To be able to implement and scale an integrated approach, you need to have a robust plan and a strategy. And this is something that I am involved in directly. The plan sets out 3 core objectives, as you can see here, and net gain and increasing our net gain across the estate is a core priority. But as you can see, well-being and productivity is also key. So the way that we implement the plan is by setting really clear targets that are programmed across the 10 years, and the targets apply to existing estates as well as the new proposed developments, where we're looking to increase our green corridors and connect with Tower Hamlets, and working in close collaboration with Tower Hamlets biodiversity officers as well as our ecologists at Greengage. So it covers a number of categories, including living roofs and things that might apply to buildings in particular, but it also focuses on the softer aspects, such as the communal space and collaboration and community engagement. So what this means in terms of net gain has been an interesting journey for us, trying to analyze it in numbers. So the strategy has been successful, but what we're seeing is trying to quantify it isn't as straightforward. So we've opted to trial the Natural England net gain metric, or the eco metric, this year. And after a year's trial, we're seeing that some aspects of this more holistic approach to capturing investment and the benefits from investment in biodiversity as part of the overall environmental net gain are showing some surprising results. As, for example, one of the categories we've been penalized for was wood production, where, you know, we're planting trees rather than cutting them down instead. So it's been an interesting journey in terms of learning to appreciate the methodology, but also respecting that it is still in development. And I would invite you, if you're looking to invest into biodiversity, to make sure that you have a robust way of measuring and capturing. The earlier presentation certainly showed a great example of this, but also take it with a pinch of salt and know that it needs to be tailored and be applicable. So simply because the numbers are not necessarily showing the right results, it doesn't mean that you should stop some good initiatives that perhaps are harder to capture, such as what Thomas just showcased, engagement with the local community. What we'd like to do moving forward with our approach is make sure that it is digitalized. So from the recent experience with COVID and being our ecologists and groundsmen not being able to do as much, what we see is really important, making sure that all of our data from iTree surveys, from any mitigations measures, is all digital. So we have a digital estate where we can zoom in and address new considerations for particular trees or particular species that are across the estate, and we're able to support them directly and action it more quickly. So I guess I've raced through the slides here, but I'll be happy to pick up more questions in the Q&A. The final thought is on integration. So we have a number of priority targets this year, including our net zero pathway. And of course, we're implementing a number of ESG targets, and climate risk is a priority. And what I'd like to stress here is the same integrated approach that I referred to earlier must apply to some of these bigger, more stringent targets. So yes, we know we want to be able to achieve net zero, but we also understand that it cannot be done so in isolation. So we look at how can investment in increasing our net gain benefit our pursuit of net zero, and if we are considering offsets, make sure that they are authentic, local and tangible. An interesting link here also comes onto the task for climate-related financial disclosures. So we're seeing that a number of metrics have emerged, and in the ideal case scenario, we will be able to invest into an integrated project that is enabling us to benefit our climate risk resilience as well, but it's being clear about how these things are connected. And the way to approach that is making sure that different disciplines are all at the same table at early stages. I think that'll be that from me, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and many thanks to all of our excellent speakers. So it's now time for the Q&A. If you haven't already, now's the time to ask a question or two to our three speakers using the Q&A function within your toolbars. We will do our best to get through as many as we can. So it's now time to introduce Jason Reeves, CEnv, Head of Policy and Communications at CEnv, the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, who will be chairing the Q&A session. So over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much for having us, and some really great talks there. So let's jump straight in. The first question came up in Chris's talk, and he's indicated he'd like to answer it, but I think it applies to all three of the speakers, and it's around how climate change relates to the work in forward projections. How do you think about what you're doing now and what you're implementing, and how viable will it be in the future? So if you look at 2040, 2050 climate projections, how are you planning for the way the world will look differently for what you're doing now? Chris, do you want to start off on that one?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So alongside the biodiversity net gain work we did, we also worked with WSP to do a climate change adaptation piece of work as well. So with the same biodiversity data that we gathered for our sites, we are able to stratify our sites according to their vulnerability to climate change. So we know that some habitats are more resilient to others. So now, alongside our biodiversity baseline, we have a list of the most vulnerable sites, so sites which have sort of wetlands like fens and reed beds on them, all the way through to things like chalk grasslands, which are much more resilient. So now we can both plan to manage sites differently in order to help them adapt to climate change, but also when we're delivering biodiversity net gain, we're able to look at the climate change vulnerability of that particular site and make judgments about how we deliver net gain based on that information as well. So we might indeed create a habitat that's more resilient on that site, or we may indeed go elsewhere in the wider landscape to deliver that net gain to get the most assurance that it's going to be resilient to climate change for the long term.
Thanks, Chris. Christina, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And that is the core of our approach as well, as I've mentioned, that perhaps being more specific when it comes to deciding where next lot of planting will go in. We don't just choose a spot at random. So analysis goes into the state of these states and the hotspots. And then, of course, in terms of the species that are going into that zone, identified area, make sure they're drought resistant. And it's really about a balance, because sometimes planting for climate change and to boost resilience means that some of the species that may be reliant on more of a wild flower meadow type planting are not able to benefit from it. So it's really trying to strike a balance between what we're doing and varying the species allocated in the right zone, really making sure it's an appropriate solution that still aligns with the wider strategy. But yeah, absolutely, climate change adaptation is a big priority as we're on our path to net gain. We need to make sure that we align the various targets.
Tom, how does this fit in with the connectivity goals?
Well, I mean, yeah, so speaking purely from what the perspective of that particular project, Wild West End and the Crown Estates going for connectivity in central London, it's fundamental to what they're trying to do. One of the reasons behind trying to create the green corridor isn't just for the sake of achieving, a target of a green corridor. It's to make sure that these green spaces are better connected. Going back to the Lawton review, and trying to make sure that these spaces are slightly more resilient to climate change. Like, the better connected they are, the better resilient they are. But it's kind of exactly the same as Christine's described. The status quo used to be that I think projects would not really consider what species they were putting in beyond kind of either the aesthetic or the local biodiversity benefit. But what we're trying to do for Wild West End now is, yes, keep the biodiversity benefit and the aesthetic as two very important factors, but really choosing species that are resilient to climate change. Like, if we're going to plant a tree now, we probably can't plant an oak tree that's used to the northern climates in the UK, in London. We have to be really looking at the resilience of those particular species to climate change and choosing species of a provenance which are likely to tolerate those conditions. I can't give you too many examples of where we've done it actively yet, because, like I said, things like street trees are very difficult to get in central London. But it's looking at things like, oak trees from the south of France, for instance, or species that are from that kind of band. That's the kind of thing we're looking at, as well as, rather than sticking with a tried and tested kind of like perfect for pollinators mixture, looking at the species which we know can tolerate longer periods of drought. 2 years ago, actually, we did our monitoring surveys. So for Wild West End, they monitor their green spaces every 2 years. We might have to skip a year this year, but we did the surveys in 2018, where there was no rain in central London between the last weekend of May and the first weekend of August. And we actually went and did some habitat surveys the last week of July. And there was only one species that had survived without management, which kind of goes back to one of the other questions in the Q&A. It's a real challenge around that. But yes, even during times when there is a little bit of management going on, things are struggling during periods like this where it just doesn't rain for weeks on end. So we are based on that survey, we completely adjusted exactly what we would be planting in certain areas. And if they couldn't be managed, or if they weren't going to have active watering, looking at species which could tolerate those kind of conditions. And we're hoping, well, in the next 4 or 5 years, to be able to kind of feed back on how successful an approach that was.
That's great.
By the way, the species that survived was Viper's bugloss, for anybody interested.
Thanks, Tom. Let's jump to that question then, because I think that's one pertinent around maintenance at the moment under lockdown, and whether you've had any issues with that. But also there's a general issue around long-term maintenance and ensuring funding and securing funding for those things. So have you had issues under lockdown, and how are you ensuring the long-term maintenance of those sites? Should we go back to Chris?
It's an interesting question. At the moment, we haven't noticed any significant impacts on biodiversity from our lack of ability to get out onto sites. Indeed, there may be a sort of a temporary sort of bump in wildlife using sites which might have been formerly more busy. Obviously, the longer lockdown were to continue, that would become increasingly risky. But now with the easing, my team is allowed back out onto sites, and as long as we're following sort of the government guidance and CEnv guidance and so on, we can start to get some management done. The long-term funding is a really interesting question that I'm tackling at the moment. The regulation in the water industry, as you can understand, is very significant. And if we're going to deliver biodiversity net gain properly, we need to be confident that we're going to be managing habitats that we've created as an offset for the next 30 years, which is a significant piece of time, given water companies are regulated in 5-yearly chunks. So we're actually investigating now how that long-term requirement can be delivered within the financial constraints or the regulatory constraints that the water industry is under. Obviously, with a biodiversity team and good recording and monitoring, we know which sites we've got and where they are, but now we just need to make sure that that financial management of that land is guaranteed as well. So I don't have all the answers to that yet, but that's one of the challenges we'll be addressing over the coming months.
Thanks, Chris. Christina, have there been any challenges during the lockdown and now with the easing?
Yeah, so our management team has been present on the estates to a lesser extent with the lockdown, and certainly coming back now with the easing. We have noticed an increase in biodiversity presence in our absence. So there are some remote benefits. I absolutely agree with what Chris is saying in terms of the long-term investments. I suppose we are fortunate on the estates, as we own the estates and all of the communal areas where our planting is, we will continue to look after as they fall under the management arm of the group. But the projects that we're interested in at the moment are in collaboration with Tower Hamlets, in particular for authentic offsetting and planting trees in Tower Hamlets and the wider borough. What we're finding is that we need to have a really robust investment structure moving forward. And perhaps the way to address that is to set up partnership with businesses such as ourselves, so it doesn't just end up falling back onto the borough's budget once, the trees are established. So the way these projects tend to work is that for 3 or 5 years, there is a partnership agreement when, if you're investing into local biodiversity, there is an agent acting on your behalf, and they make sure that the trees are established and they're well looked after and they have appropriate care for the type of species that are being planted. But moving beyond that is what we're looking at the moment, is making sure there's a robust plan for who has responsibility over what, even though we don't own the land, but we are invested into making sure that those trees continue to bring benefits. So it's not a one-off. And this is where the business partnerships, I think, could be a key to unlocking that potential.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to add anything to that?
We've had issues getting access to sites. Yeah, as you'd imagine. We were supposed to be doing monitoring surveys this year, but which would be bird, bat, and invertebrate and habitat surveys of all the green spaces within the Wild West End Partnership area. But with nobody in the offices and access is effectively denied, which is fine because it's only monitoring, so it's something that probably can be picked up later. But yes, in terms of management, I can see it being quite an issue. Some of the more publicly accessible spaces, as Christina said, like there's management contracts, and actually people going there they would be there kind of very early in the morning anyway doing this watering, so actually they're completely capable of achieving social distancing, adequate health and safety provision, and making sure that certain spaces are looked after. But where it requires more active management, maybe at rooftop level, where there are a couple more barriers to access, yes, it's a real challenge. I suppose this is, the lessons we learned in 2018 around management of green space in the face of a more harsh climate. Something like this is just going to make them even more focused, because there may be periods where more and longer periods where access for management will not be possible. So it's incumbent upon us as ecological designers to design spaces which are resilient to these kind of conditions and able to survive, thrive, and recover as a result. So it's going to be quite challenging to design it, and I wonder how realistic it will be to have kind of colourful flower boxes everywhere at all times of the year now, versus more of an idea behind creating, actually letting people understand that there are some species which die at some times of year. bringing back seasonality to our green spaces, and that's going to be an important thing, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a real engagement journey there.
Mm-hmm.
Another question for you, Tom, around the Wild West End project and how that can work in other cities. We've got an example here of how someone has tried to do this in Peterborough, but where we get to trying to find the person responsible, based in Panama or some offshore island somewhere, found it impossible to do. Is it possible to apply this to other cities? Have you got lessons learned? I suppose is what they're asking.
We do recognise that the Wild West End Partnership, as it currently stands, is, unless somebody wants to correct me, a globally unique kind of approach to achieving a multifunctional green space in an urban environment. We recognise that we were the right place at the right time, and we had the right people leading it. So it wasn't just that Arup happened to be telling people what to do. Like, the person we were dealing with at the Crown Estate was already had the vision and already had the position and the responsibility to be able to help the partnership deliver it. The head of sustainability at the Crown Estate at the time really pushed for this, and because, I mean, if it's a company like the Crown Estate or Grosvenor or Shaftesbury or these long-term owners and managers of property portfolios, there will be somebody who is either head of sustainability or head of stewardship whose responsibility will be this kind of long-term thinking. This kind of model is far less likely to work in the kind of build-to-sell real estate model, because there's no kind of incentive for creating green spaces for the long term if all you care about is selling meters squared and leaving with your money. So I think this is replicable. I do believe it's replicable globally, but you have to have a couple of conditions there, that there are enough, there's a critical mass of built space where you can actually achieve this, and the right people in the right positions who are either influential enough to have this to achieve it, and you've got to give them the right message too at the right time. So it's not impossible, but it does require a lot of effort, actually. So there's a couple of pieces coming into place.
So there's some work for us there in building the case for this to be done more widely.
We are looking at the case right now in terms of doing natural capital and social value studies. So I think, for the Crown Estate, for instance, in the last 5 years, they've gone from 52 meters squared of green space within their central London portfolio, 52 to 3,410 was the latest figure that I saw. So, and this is just through setting up a system where they were able to ensure that green space was established in all of their buildings. And now they're in a position to be able to look and say, well, what is the natural capital value and what is the social value? What are they giving back as a result of some of these green spaces? That's the argument that seems to be really powerful for some of the public realm managers in particular. If we can demonstrate that it's giving back a little bit for biodiversity and natural capital, but that the social value of people being able to see, touch, smell, interact with these green spaces, it's becoming a very, very powerful argument for getting some of these things done, and convincing the people who have wielded this power and chosen to not use it yet. Yeah, so the value story, I think, as you say, is very, very important, critical for us to get it right.
We've very swiftly run out of time, so I'd like to thank the panel. Thank you very much. It was some great talks and some great answers to the questions there. So I'll just hand back to Sarah.
Thank you, Jason, and that was really great, everyone. And a great thank you again to Chris, Tom, Christina, and Jason for spending time with us today and providing such great insight. Now, before you all disappear, I am aware that it's now 11 o'clock. I have some further opportunities you might be interested in. Okay, so firstly, on Thursday, we have the final part of the Biodiversity webinar series featuring Becky Fisher of Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. Becky will provide really great insight into the Trust approach to engaging the public on biodiversity, which focuses on behaviour change and community empowerment. To book your place on this webinar, visit the website address on your screen now. So to gain even more insight on biodiversity, we also have our recently launched biodiversity website hub, developed in collaboration with some of our key partners, some of which have joined us today in Canary Wharf Group and CEnv. Here you will find tons of resources and inspirational ideas on how you can help to protect and enhance the biodiversity that we all live amongst. We're looking for actions large and small. They can all make a really positive difference. So to get involved, visit socenv.org.uk/biodiversity 2020. And then later this year, we have our next webinar series, which is based around the topic of natural capital. So if you are a CEnv or RM Tech and you have a project that you'd like to showcase and allow other environmental professionals to learn from, please get in touch with me. If you're interested to hear more about the CEnv or RM Tech registers, please take a look at our How to Become and Why Become recorded webinars on our website. You'll also find all the recordings from our last series, which was climate change. They're also available on the Society for the Environment YouTube channel, where you can subscribe to gain notifications of new webinar recordings and other SocEnv content. The recordings for this series, including yesterday's and today's webinars, will also be available shortly. Next up, annually we showcase the achievements and commitment to environmental good practice of our registrants via our awards. The nominations are now closed and the finalists have been decided. For the first time this year, we have 2 awards up for grabs, the Environmental Professional of the Year and a new award for 2020, the Registrant Newcomer of the Year. The announcement of the award winners and highly commended finalists will be an online affair this year, taking place this Friday, World Environment Day, at 4 p.m. UK time. For this, I'd like to encourage you to join the live announcement on Zoom and show your support for the outstanding work of the finalists. It's a free event, so please register your attendance via the website address on your screen now. And that's it from us today. Thank you for listening and taking part. If you're watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. That would be great. Many thanks again to all our speakers and chair for the Q&A for the excellent content. And we'll see you in the next webinar, which is Thursday. Don't miss it. Thank you for watching and stay safe.